Welcome to On the X. My guest today is Ashok Gupta, founder of the Gupta Program, a brain retraining and neuroplasticity system designed to help people recover from chronic conditions like ME or chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and long COVID. Ashok's work began while he was a student at Cambridge University, where he developed chronic fatigue syndrome himself. When traditional treatments didn't help, he started researching the brain's role in chronic illness and eventually created the techniques that he says helped him fully recover. Today, the Gupta Program is used by tens of thousands of people around the world, combining brain retraining exercises, mindfulness, and lifestyle tools aimed at calming and resetting the nervous system. So here we go with Ashok Gupta on the X. For people that are not familiar with your backstory and what brought you to developing the Gupta Program, just kind of cover that. What happened to you exactly?
Yes, I'd love to share. So, as we've talked in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, I was studying as an undergrad at Cambridge and I was living life, burning the candle on both ends. I was partying, I was doing the normal social things that people do when they go to college or university, but also was getting very stressed out about my work. And I got some kind of virus and it was like, no big deal, some kind of flu virus, a stomach bug, that kind of thing. And over time, I seemed to feel worse and worse, and the bug seemed to go, but my health deteriorated. It got worse and worse and worse to the point at which, I describe it like your worst day of flu times 5,
Yeah.
where you literally have no energy, feel exhausted, and you just don't understand why. And I would go from doctor to doctor, and they would say, "We don't know what you have. We don't know what to call it. There's no treatment for it. You're on your own. Goodbye." And you can
Yeah.
imagine for a young man in the prime, this was like a brick wall in front of me. And they would say, "You may have this for the rest of your life. We don't know what causes it. We think we may call it ME or chronic fatigue syndrome, but we don't really have terminology for it." And it wasn't really taken seriously then.
Yep.
And I'd met, hundreds of others at conferences who were also suffering. And in that moment, I couldn't read the words on a page. I couldn't do normal activities. I felt completely wiped out 100% of the time. And I remember making a contract with the universe to say, if I can just get myself, 50% better, 70% better, 30% better, I will dedicate the rest of my life to helping others with these types of mysterious illnesses. And there was one fateful day, Chris, when I was at a bookstore in Cambridge. I think it was a Waterstones. You probably also
Yeah,
visited
yeah,
it at
yeah,
some point.
yeah.
And I was in that bookstore, and in those days, we didn't have the, such a developed internet. So of course we were using bookstores. And I remember I was in the self-help section and the neurology section. And there was one book just jutting off the shelf that just called to me. And I picked that one book off the shelf. And the book was called The Emotional Life of the Brain by Professor Joseph Ledoux, who was the primary expert on the amygdala, part of the brain, back in the 80s and 90s. And I read that book and I thought, wow, this actually helps me understand what's going on in my brain. And in an ad hoc way, I retrained my brain. I managed to get myself 100% better within 6 months and then set up a clinic to treat others. And that's been the 25-year journey of then working with hundreds of patients, now thousands of patients around the world, 7 clinical studies, and of course, our app. And it's just come a long way in the last 30 years. It's been a 30-year journey to get to this point.
When you were kind of in that bookstore, I'm assuming still in a very sort of dysfunctional state, and that book kind of presented itself to you, whatever you want to think about that occurrence happening. Where were you at were you just like resigned to, I'm just going to be like this for the rest of my life? Were you still chasing medical answers, or were you looking, okay, this is something brain related or something like that?
So interesting. I was actually on a roller coaster. So there'd be a day where perhaps
Yeah.
I'd feel more optimistic and I'd think, okay, I need to research this. I need to figure this out. And there'd be other days where it was just a wipeout. I just did not have any energy, no motivation, almost suicidal on certain days, thinking, the doctor would give me antidepressants, wouldn't make any difference. And I would think, am I just depressed? Is that all this is? And then I realized, no, that's not what it is, because I've never had inklings of that in the past. This was definitely something going on in my physical body, that exhaustion and the negative effects were an after effect. So yeah, it was an up or down, depending on the particular day.
The thing that I've followed your stuff for a long time. I've been through your program. I think it's amazing. But I can't imagine developing it. I can't imagine having the tenacity and the perseverance to try that. And because it's not an overnight fix, this isn't something like I take a pill for 5 days and, oh, I've cleared up the bacteria or something like that. How did you do that? How did you figure out how to do this? I mean, that part just amazes me that somebody could come up with this kind of a system and stick with it, especially again, where there's not like a quick fix. It takes a while to kind of kick in, so to speak, or eventually have the right effect.
Yes, of course. So they say necessity is the mother of all invention. And I
Right.
was really in the thick of that concept that I had no choice. There were no medical answers, and I had to try and figure this out. So as I was reading not just that book, but then started reading other things and then started experimenting with some breathing techniques and meditation techniques, then I started thinking about, well, actually, the breathing meditation helps, but it's not the core reason. So then I said, okay, if this hypothesis is true, if this is what's going on in my brain, what else can I do? And I started experimenting with different literal cognitive exercises of when my body feels a certain way, what do I observe in my brain? So it's a moment or a period of time of introspection, of really
Mhm.
noting what's going on in the periphery of my consciousness. So most people, we're going through life unconsciously. We're just reacting to our unconscious impulses. And it takes sometimes a shock in life or a divorce, an illness, to make us take a step back and observe, what is it about me that I haven't taken into account before? What's going on in the periphery of my consciousness or my unconscious? And of course, we're not saying that these mysterious illnesses like long COVID or chronic fatigue are in the mind, definitely not in the mind, but there is something that is on the periphery of our brain's activity that we are not normally connected to, we're not aware of, that actually, if we could influence, we could actually heal so many different conditions, so many different mysterious illnesses. So I think for me, it was, I've got to do this. No one else is going to help me. And I am forced to confront everything, every thought, every pattern, every resistance, every piece of fatigue, and put it under the microscope to understand what is going on here.
All those. So you brought up a great point, which is I want to say, I mean, gosh, early 90s. I don't even know if I'd ever heard of something like chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia. I don't even know if those terms were really out there yet. They're much more well known these days. And you talk about other ones that are long COVID and things. But for most of those people that struggle with those conditions, I think they quickly realize it's just a name for a bunch of symptoms most often, right? If chronic fatigue syndrome is literally just telling you what your main symptom is, it's like not telling you anything about the root cause, right? Like I always say it's like going to the doctor and saying my head hurts, and they say, well, you have a headache, and you'd be like, I know that. Why do I have a headache? The underlying thing of your system is kind of really explaining. There's not just theoretically, but giving an explanation as to what's actually causing those syndromes, and they're all kind of have this shared brain issue that's going on. So talk about that. Talk about the kind of the underlying problem that's going on for the most part. Not that there's not other mitigating factors or something like Lyme disease or whatever, right? But what's going on in the brain that's contributing so much to people's symptomology and those conditions?
Yes, I'd love to share that because this is my favorite topic to talk about is what is the cause of so many modern illnesses that we see. In fact, we
Right.
think this hypothesis may represent at least 50% of the conditions that someone goes to see their doctor for, in terms of the underlying hypothesis as the,
Any condition.
or yeah, half of the conditions that someone goes to see a doctor for. Yeah, or
Okay.
potentially contributing to any condition, but
Okay.
about
Got it. Got
half
it.
of the
Got it. Yeah.
conditions I think
Yeah.
this
Yeah. Yeah.
explains.
Yep.
So I'd like to start this kind of explanation of these mysterious illnesses with the biggest question of all: why are we here? Right? And Chris, I'd love to
Okay.
have a
We're
philosophical
going deep.
conversation at another time about the meaning of life, the origins of life. But let's
Right.
look at it
Yeah.
from a scientific perspective. That we as human beings are here on this planet and we've survived because this brain, this nervous system, and this immune system have evolved over millions of years, from single-celled organisms to plant life, invertebrates, vertebrates, reptiles, mammals, human beings. People don't realize this, but we actually contain the adaptations of all of those different species. So I love this statistic. We share 40% of the same DNA as a banana, right? So however these
Right.
plants and these these species have evolved to adapt to our environment, we have gained all of that evolutionary advantage, and it's programmed into our system to survive. So we are survival machines. And as survival machines, the number one priority of our system is to survive, procreate, and pass on our genes to the next generation. And therefore, physical survival is the number one priority in that sequence at an unconscious level. And so if we fast forward now to our modern world, we live in a world where our system is now exposed to so many more threats than it was in previous generations. Different types of threats, shall we say. And so therefore, the system is now on high alert a lot more of the time. So from our evolutionary basis, we were, eating organic food, living outdoors, generally probably more healthy inherently, but we didn't have access to modern healthcare. So we didn't live as long. Yeah? But essentially, we didn't have so many threats on the system. But now, fast forward to the modern day, we live indoors, in boxes, out of natural daylight, eating toxic food, drinking toxic water full of, various chemicals. We're exposed to pollution. We're sedentary, staring at a screen, getting stressed about everybody else and how successful they are. Essentially, that's what we've done to modern civilization. Yeah. And therefore, as a result of that, our system is constantly exposed to threats. And therefore, it's just living on the edge. It's always thinking, when is the next threat going to come? Which is why many of us have this low-grade inflammation, this sense of, I don't quite have the energy or the excitement or the motivation I used to have, simply because the system is being stimulated and it thinks we're under threat a lot of the time, which is why we get more anxiety and more depression in the population as that increases. And let's take the example of COVID, because now we know a lot of people have got long COVID, they have lingering effects after COVID. So let's take the example of a COVID infection. The COVID infection comes along, and if the system is under threat, the system malfunctions. And so when the COVID infection comes along, it fights off the infection, but it leaves a legacy in the brain, and we'll come on to those brain structures, the amygdala and the insular part of the brain. It leaves a legacy in those parts of the brain that we're still under threat and still under danger, even if the COVID virus goes, even if we successfully fight it off. And that then means the brain becomes hyperreactive and hypersensitive. Okay. And to help us understand this, because it's a very complex kind of neurology that I'm trying to summarize. So I love to use some analogies that I think, Chris, you'll enjoy here. So imagine we call it the...
I know this one. I know this analogy.
Oh, you know this one? Fantastic.
Yeah.
We'll explain this one. We used to call it the Game of Thrones analogy, but apparently that was too violent for our anxious patients. So we now call it the fairy tale analogy. So we now call it the fairy tale analogy. So imagine you are King Chris. There's a nice ring to it. King Chris.
That's what I tell my family. Call me
your partner, your family. Exactly. Right. I'm King Chris.
Yeah.
Everyone better remember that. So you are King Chris of your kingdom, and your kingdom is your body. And you as King Chris are the prefrontal cortex. You are the conscious, rational mind. And you have two defenders of your kingdom, your army and your navy, who defend your kingdom. And just to bring this really real, so this is actually some props that we use to help patients understand what's going on. So we have the army, which is the nervous system, the information flows around the body that is the instructional piece. It's the part that instructs the rest of the body on what to do. And then we have the navy. The navy, and this is obviously you very much relate to this. The navy represents the immune system, and the system that actually orchestrates all the aspects of the immune system to defend us from dangers. So these are our two sentinels that protect the body, the generals, the army and navy generals. Now, imagine, and in the kingdom that you are the king of now has a drought. So if the kingdom has a drought, that means the kingdom is generally weaker. And that relates to my idea that the kingdom is constantly having threats. One threat being a drought in the kingdom. So now your kingdom's weaker, your army and navy is weaker. Then imagine that an invading army comes over the hill. So an invader comes over the hill during the drought. That means that the army and navy are now more threatened than they would normally be, because they're not sure if they're going to be successful at fighting off this invader because they're weaker. So they work valiantly to protect the kingdom. They fight off the invading army, but they are not sure if they completely fought it off. So they managed to successfully defeat the army, but they are not sure if the army is still hiding behind the hill or hiding in the forest, or perhaps some spies are somewhere. So to err on the side of caution, the army and navy continue to fire off their weapons of war, their missiles, their bows and arrows, their cannonballs. They keep firing off their weapons of war to defend the kingdom. And some of those weapons now fall back in the kingdom. And that's where we get the inflammation in the body, the tightness in the nervous system, because the system now is in hypersensitive mode, hyperdefense mode. And therefore, there's now inflammation, autoimmune effects, etc., etc. And the more they fire off the weapons of war, even though the invader is gone, the more and more weak the kingdom becomes. Until at one point, the weaker it gets, they then think, oh, the kingdom is so weak now that we have to keep firing off more weapons of war, and we get stuck in that cycle. And then opportunistic spies start flourishing in the kingdom, which means that we get opportunistic infections, sensitivities, allergies, more and more fatigue. And when they come to their weekly meeting with you, King Chris, they say, maybe we're still in danger. Please continue to give us all the resources, the wheat, the iron, the corn, the water, all the supplies need to go to the army and navy. So as they get more and more supplies, the kingdom itself becomes weaker and weaker. And you as the king think, well, that's the right thing to do. If these guys are telling me this is where we need resources, that's where everything goes. And we can identify this as the army and navy generals now becoming traumatized by the impact of war. They keep firing off their weapons at harmless triggers, like we get people who are traumatized on the battlefield. And once that system occurs, we then have ongoing weakness. So that's when an acute infection or acute trigger now becomes a chronic illness. And brain retraining is actually, or the neuroplasticity that we use, is when these army and navy generals come to their weekly meeting with you, you say to them, my dear generals, you have done a wonderful job at defending the kingdom, but you can stand down. The war is over. And they won't believe you the first time or the second time or the third time, but it is through repeated brain retraining that we train these parts of our nervous and immune systems that we are no longer under threat. And we don't normally have control over the nervous and immune systems, but we figured out ways in which we can regain control over those unconscious systems. An analogy that I think a lot of your listeners will enjoy. When do you think the last soldier was taken off duty at the end of the Second World War?
I know this. I know this. I don't know the exact. It's something like 1975 or 78 or something like that.
Exactly. I believe it's 1974. Yeah.
Okay.
There's a Japanese soldier. You're absolutely right. Who was positioned or posted on an island in the Pacific, and he was told the war's over. Yeah, 1945, 1946. It's over.
Right.
But he kept defending his island because he didn't believe it. He thought it was a trick. So for 30 years, he continued to defend the island. And it was only when his senior generals, who had now, moved on to civilian life, they came to that island, they said, it's over. You can no longer defend the kingdom. Did they finally stand down? Which I think is such a crazy story and a poignant story. And so it is with our systems. Our dear beloved immune and nervous systems, they care about us so much. They are so invested in this idea of protection and survival that they will keep defending us no matter what. And people often say, well, what's the precedent for this? Actually, it's staring us in the face. If we look at people who died from COVID during the pandemic, during lockdown, they didn't die because of the COVID virus, COVID-19 infection. They died from a cytokine storm where the own immune system caused the secondary effects of pneumonia, tightening up all the airways and the lungs. It was our own immune and nervous systems trying to overprotect us, which then caused people to die, and they needed oxygen and various things. So that in a nutshell is the hypothesis, as we believe, explains why acute things turn into chronic things. Why does fear turn into anxiety? Why does sadness turn into long-term depression? Why does pain turn into chronic pain? Why does, let's say, Lyme disease or mold illness or chemical sensitivities turn into long-term sensitivities? Or why does fatigue turn into long-term disease? It's all down to these brain structures that get traumatized and then start overprotecting us and creating vicious cycles in our brain and body.
why does this happen to some people and not to other people, right? Like, why does and let me back up a little bit there. Do you at this point kind of view all these things as the same thing? Like, I know you have the kind of overarching terminology of like neuroinflammatory chronic syndromes, or I think that's right. It's something like that. Do you
Neuroimmune condition syndromes.
Condition syndrome, that's right. Do you just basically think they're all the same at this point? Like whether it's long COVID or fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome, or even like in military circles, we have a thing called operator syndrome. I don't know if you've heard of this, but I have arguments with people where I basically say operator syndrome is just another one of these chronic inflammatory limbic system impairment type conditions, and be like, no, but you don't understand. We have environmental toxins and burn pits. And I'm like, yeah, but what's actually happening in the body? The response that's going on is the same thing. So do you view those all as effectively the same condition?
It's such a great question. It depends how we categorize. The way I see it is that the inputs to the system are different.
Mm-hmm.
The mechanism of learning is the same. And then the constellation of symptoms at the end is different. So what I mean by that is, if somebody has been exposed to toxins, and as you say, on the battlefield, that has happened in recent memory, then those will become the conditioned stimuli, the sense that the thing that the brain is hyperreactive to. But the mechanism, the amygdala and insular conditioning effects, will be the same in hypothesis. That's what we hypothesize. But then the cluster of symptoms that they will experience will be unique to the original sensitizing event. So if toxic exposure was the original trigger, the way the body responded when we were on the battlefield and there were those toxins, that's what it will then get chronically stuck in, and it will create this chronic over-response as if toxins are still being presented to the body.
Yeah. Yep.
So what that means is that the overall mechanism is the same, but the cluster of symptoms that someone will experience will be different depending on the original sensitizing cause.
Yeah.
And so we call these neuroimmune condition syndromes. So neuro because it's the brain and the nervous system, immune because it's the immune system. Conditioned, it simply means the brain has learnt a new defensive strategy which prioritizes itself over any other mechanism in the body and brain. And syndrome because it's a unique cluster of symptoms that are unique to each patient depending on the original sensitizing event.
Yep.
So yes, I see them as all very similar. So what that means is the conditions may be different in the cluster of symptomatology, but perhaps the way that we heal ourselves could be very similar. And that's where then brain retraining comes in.
Yeah. And I just think that that's so helpful because it's sort of like the way cancer presents itself, right? Cancer, the cause, the trigger, what causes cancer in somebody is varied and can be completely different. But to your point, the mechanism of basically metastasized cells that are growing out of control is the same across cancer, but then it can be in different parts of your body. It can be in your lungs or your liver or your brain or whatever. But we recognize, okay, that's all cancer though. Like the mechanism is the same. And I just think it would be such an important thing for people to recognize, of the mechanism being the same for all of these things. So going back to the other question I had, why some people and not others? Why do some people succumb to this and others do not?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. And of course, we're always very careful to say these conditions are not psychological. However, we do think we see some common threads in terms of certain personality traits that are more likely for this conditioning effect to happen in the brain. And we believe this is when people have a background potentially of trauma. And trauma can be in so many different ways. So we know, for instance, that this starts even pre-womb. So we know that the stress of the mother at the time of conception and during gestation, pregnancy, impacts on the stress levels of the child. We know that the mental stress of the father during conception can impact on the stress of the child, which I think is, once again, some fascinating studies on this. And then the birth experience itself impacts on the stress of the brain. Then the most impactful is the first 5 to 10 years of life. So if a child has felt unnurtured, not protected, has experienced abuse, bullying, trauma, or just feels that their life is under threat, that will create conditioning effects in the amygdala and other parts of the brain that then get stored up for later in life. And what that means is that traditionally we think of trauma in the psychological sense. But actually, the brain does not differentiate between emotional trauma, biological trauma, toxic trauma. It simply says, what are the threats to my system? What is my package of responses? So what that means is, and a study by Kaiser Permanente showed this, people who have a background of trauma are more than twice as likely to get inflammatory conditions later in life than
Mm.
those who haven't. So we have some science behind this. And we notice this time and time again in our clinic. So if someone has that, it simply means their system feels more vulnerable. So if they've been exposed to threats in childhood, the brain perceives that there are more threats in adulthood and will then create overprotective responses in response to what might be normal biological or toxic threats. And then that is magnified on the battlefield. So on the battlefield, whether a soldier has a background of trauma or not, on the battlefield, they are directly in traumatic experiences, traumatic states where their life is threatened. So you then have the perfect storm of a biological threat, which can be the toxins and various things that they experience on the battlefield, combined with extreme trauma over weeks and months, if not years, that then can combine for these conditioning effects to happen with obviously conditions like Gulf War syndrome and others. And that's why that trauma can be a risk factor at any point in someone's life.
Behind every Navy SEAL is a long chain of enablers, logistics, and family. And behind all that is you. When a warrior or their loved ones need support, donor funding makes it possible, delivering critical programs when they matter most. You're not just a donor, you are that warrior. Learn how you can get involved at NavySealFoundation.org. It's so interesting to me that basically fear and inflammation are so tied to one another, because it'd be one thing if you have a traumatic experience where it triggers a true like sort of fear sensation, and then that results in anxiety, and I can see how that snowballs on itself. But like in your case where you get a virus, something that's essentially unconscious, right? Like you are not thinking, oh, I'm so afraid of this virus or something like that. In my case, it was a mold exposure that triggered my kind of downfall. That is so fascinating to me because like there's like in my case, there was no fear around it. I didn't even know what was going on. It was like accidental. It wasn't until later that I figured out what had happened in terms of exposure. But I went from one day seemingly fine to the next day incapacitated. And it was like, what happened? Right. And it's just such an amazing thing that can happen. I just find it fascinating that that's possible.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? And I think this comes down to the way that traditional medicine has pigeonholed certain kinds of conditions or certain ways the brain acts. So as
Yeah.
an example, if you go to a hospital, there's a separate psychology department, a separate immunology
Yeah.
department, a separate
Totally.
endocrine department. But actually, the whole system is malfunctioning in a lot of these conditions. So it's like the whole team has to get together and work at it from different angles. And the main reason is that the amygdala part of the brain in traditional science has been associated with PTSD, anxiety, mood
Yes.
disorders, etc., and other emotional disorders. But the brain doesn't say that. It doesn't say, well, this part of the brain is where psychology operates, and this part of the brain is where biology operates. It's one integrated system. So the amygdala actually is your overall threat detection system, psychology, biology, toxic
Yes.
threats. It's across all of them. So if we have an amygdala that is more emotionally charged by previous emotional experiences, it's now going to be more protective against toxic threats, against viral threats, because it generalizes how threatening its environment is. And that to me is fascinating that the brain operates in that way. And that explains so much about how and why people who have adverse childhood experiences, who have backgrounds of trauma, are twice as likely, sometimes more, 2 to 3 times more likely to get chronic illnesses later in life, and their immunity is going to be compromised because actually their immunity is overreacting and underreacting at the same time. We can
Yeah.
have an immune system which is overreactive and ineffective, which is
Right.
then
Yeah.
helping us understand that.
A couple more questions just kind of on the how this happens, and then I want to get into your program and how it undoes these things. Um, what about people that are just like, yeah, Ashok, that's great, but you don't understand. I have Lyme disease, right? I have Lyme disease. I have a bacteria that's a spirochete that is keeping me sick. Like, what's your response? Because there are mitigating factors here that can be just biological, if you want to call them that, right? Like there can be a disease burden of some sort. There can be what you said at the beginning, some kind of toxic burden that's going on with people. What's the interplay there, and how do you respond to that?
Yes, it's such a fascinating area. So it's all about how these factors interact. So, as an example, not everybody who has a COVID-19 infection goes on to getting chronic long haul COVID, right? The long term effects. Not everybody who gets Lyme or is exposed to Lyme bacteria goes on to getting chronic Lyme. So
Yep.
X plus Y does not equal Z. It's not that because we're exposed to these toxins or these bacteria, we're automatically going to get a chronic condition. And so what happens is, let's take the example of Lyme disease. So Lyme disease obviously is quite impactful on our system in terms of that exposure to that bacteria from a tick bite, let's say. It has an effect on the system where in our model, we believe the immune system then starts overreacting. Yep, it starts getting into a chronic state because of the impact of that original bacteria. Now, once the system gets stuck in that state, it can then stop being effective at dealing with chronic opportunistic infections. So it could be that actually, as this immune system now gets dysregulated, over responding, the nervous system is over responding, then the body's ability to deal with these opportunistic chronic infections gets lowered. And we see this in many different conditions, that actually opportunistic infections like human herpes virus, those can increase in those with chronic stress as
Mm-hmm.
opportunistic infections that start flourishing that were normally kept a lid on by the immune system. So it could be with Lyme. You could still detect the Lyme bacteria in the body, but why is the body not dealing with it effectively and clearing it? It's because immunity is compromised, and therefore the immune system is not working efficiently to deal with what it can deal with in a normal sense in most people, which is why not everybody will get all of these particular conditions. It's where immune system malfunctions. Either it becomes overactive or underactive, or both at the same time. And there's a whole field of this, psychoneuroimmunology, where we know that stress, anxiety, depression depresses our immunity and then makes it more likely that these opportunistic infections can flourish. So what I would say is, even if people have the labs and it shows that there are abnormalities in the body, even if it's clear that the bacteria is still present, that does not mean that actually, if I were to boost my own immunity and make my own immune system work laser focused, really powerful, that my own system couldn't clear that up. And in fact, with Lyme disease, we had close to 100%. So in a recent clinical study we did, in terms of health and functioning, we had close to a 100% improvement in health and functioning after 3 months of using our brain retraining program. And we're looking to do larger scale Lyme studies. In fact, we've just done a mold study on about 150 patients, and a lot of them had Lyme as well, because mold and
Mm-hmm.
Lyme tend to come together. And we had, in that study, and that hasn't been published yet, so this is hot off the press. In that study, we showed that after 3 months, there was close to a third reduction in mold, and after 6 months, a halving of mold symptoms and the impact that it had on someone's life. And of course, if people continue with that, we hope to get people to 80, 90, 100% out of mold disease, a mold illness. And then we're looking at Lyme as a secondary component there. So yeah, this is what I think is really exciting, is that these conditions, which were previously mysterious, there wasn't seeming much hope for people, we're getting people better. And I think there are going to be ways in which we crack the nut on this.
Yeah, it's one. I had a conversation with another guy yesterday where I was saying that I think often we get the order wrong, in the sense that it's one thing if you have an acute condition, you got to go to the doctor, you got to get some antibiotics or something. But I often think that people chase kind of like physical detoxification and things like that, and they would be better served by doing your type of program first, because then that stuff is received so much better. Like when your system isn't on high alert all the time, those other things actually work a lot better. You're in a much more open state that's not resisting everything that's coming into your body. And I just think that is lost on so many people, in my estimation.
Yes, I think that's such an interesting observation, because I was recently presenting at a conference in San Diego, the International Integrative Mental Health Conference, and Dr. Neil Nathan was presenting there. I don't know
Yeah,
if you
I know
Dr.
Neil.
Neil Nathan.
He
He's one of
treated
the
me for a while. Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah, exactly. A very
Yeah.
famous doctor, an amazing
Yep.
guy. In
Is
terms
he
of
okay,
mold.
by the way? I thought he got sick. He got like sick or something like for a
Um,
while. Is
I'm not sure. I met him recently.
okay.
He
Okay.
seemed,
Good. That's
yeah,
good to
seems
hear.
good. Hopefully, I wish
Okay.
him
Good.
hopefully as well.
Good. Yeah.
And he did his presentation on mold, and I'm thinking, okay, he's going to go through binders, he's going to go through detoxification protocols, etc. The very first slide that he put up into this major international conference was, to start off treating mold disease, we have to do brain retraining, nervous system regulation. That is the most
Yeah.
important thing. And he flashed up our program on his slide. And I was thinking, that's so fascinating that I did not know that many doctors who are experts in the field of mold, and not necessarily so much in Lyme, they're now saying that brain retraining, and our program being one of them, is the first thing we want to do, because if we can get the system regulated and reduce the symptomatology, then it's more open to all the nutrients, the supplements, the
Yes.
medications that we can give to finally rid the body of these mycotoxins. And that for me is really showing how important now these processes are to healing people.
Yeah. In fact, now that I think about it, I heard about your program from Neil. That's where I
Right.
learned about your program. Yep. Because it was like I read his book, Toxic, and I was like, okay, finally somebody that's speaking some sense to me here. And I think he mentions it in his book. And then when I
Yes.
talked to him, and I know that he has become just a bigger and bigger cheerleader of neural retraining as like basically the first step. Like you should do that first, essentially, if you're in kind of one of these toxic states of some sort.
I want to pause for a moment and acknowledge a brand that's doing something you don't see very often anymore. GHOSTBED didn't just sponsor an episode. They stepped up to support the entire IRONCLAD network, and that matters. GHOSTBED is built by people who care deeply about quality. It's a product-first company led by Mark Warner, who still shows up every day obsessed with doing things the right way. Their mattresses are all made in America, engineered with advanced cooling technology, breathable materials, and zero shortcuts. They have 3 different collections to choose from, and they've built an online sleep quiz, so you can dial in exactly what works for your body. And behind it all is a real in-house team of sleep experts, never outsourced. Right now, we have an exclusive offer for our listeners that beats any other discount out there. Go to ghostbed.com/onthex and use code ONTHEX for an extra 15% off site-wide. When you support them, you're not just buying a mattress. You're supporting the kind of companies that keep independent, high-stakes storytelling alive.
Last question on this, because you sort of gave the analogy, but talk about how this snowballs on itself internally, right? Where the symptoms feed the kind of the amygdala response, the limbic response, and that makes it right where, because I think some people listening to this who may not be familiar with it, they don't have a personal experience, they don't know somebody who's been in these conditions, doesn't realize that you can be completely incapacitated, bedbound from essentially just a brain loop that is keeping you this way, and how it's just feeding on itself and keeping you sick and keeping you sick and keeping you sick.
Yes. So in terms of this brain loop, so bringing back our little characters here, as we said, as the Army and Navy are firing off more weapons of war, a lot of those weapons of war are falling back in the kingdom. So the kingdom itself is now getting weaker. But the weaker the kingdom gets, the more that these guys interpret this as we are still in danger, because look how weak our own kingdom is becoming.
Right.
And the way to think about this is conditioning. We think of classical conditioning. So Pavlov's dogs. I think we've all heard of those analogy where, so Pavlov, famous Russian scientist, he said, okay, I noticed that when it's lunchtime and my dogs are coming to go and come in and get their lunch, they salivate because they're ready to eat the food. But if I ring a bell, they associate the ringing the bell for lunchtime as the fact they're going to get this food. So now I can ring the bell at any time of the day and these dogs salivate. So this shows us that the bell is nothing to do with necessarily lunch coming, but the brain sees that as a conditioned stimulus. It sees that as something that represents a second thing. And so it is with our bodies. Imagine if, for people trying to understand this, imagine when you have flu you feel exhausted, you feel demotivated. And that's deliberate. Your brain wants you to do nothing. It wants you to feel down, depressed, demotivated, because it wants you to rest. Because if you got flu and you felt exuberant and excited and want to do lots of things, you would compromise your own immunity. Now, imagine you've got the flu, and what then happens is your immune system is fighting off the influenza virus. But imagine if now your immune system sees the very physical symptoms in your body as representing the flu virus. So the flu virus is gone, but the brain says, oh, but I've still got these symptoms in my body. That must indicate that the flu virus is still present. That's like the bell ringing, the conditioned stimulus. And once that happens, the brain says, hey, I'm experiencing all these symptoms. The flu's still here. So that thing comes up in the brain. The brain then says, let me trigger the immune system and nervous system. That then creates symptoms in the body. The body then experiences all the fatigue, exhaustion, all the other symptoms, the immune symptoms, the gut problems, the lack of detoxification. Those symptoms then, by the vagus nerve, tell the brain that we're in danger. The brain says we're in danger, stimulate the immune system and nervous system. And that's how you get a vicious loop. And that's how something that starts off just like a normal flu, a normal virus that feels very normal, can turn into such a chronic long-term condition that can last years, decades even. It's because, for those people, in physics, how do we get, a kind of wave function, or how do we get a chronic system? It's when the input and the output of the system get locked together. So if the input and the output of the system get locked together, then we will get waves and we will get things escalating and then coming down and escalating at vicious cycles and virtuous cycles. And that's what we hypothesize is happening here.
So how does your system undo this? How does it work? What does it involve? I mean, the greatest thing about it is you're not talking about taking any supplements or drugs or anything. It's behavioral. You're basically using your conscious behavior to rewire your unconscious programming. So how does it work?
Yeah, so this is the great thing. Many people ask us, are we sticking electrodes into people's brains and stimulating it? Or are we using, different chemicals? Actually, this is all through the power of the brain. And people might say, oh, so you're saying it's psychological. I would say, no, it's not psychological. It's harnessing neuroplasticity. The fact that your brain rewires itself through repetition and intensity of emotion or intensity of experience. And what we do is we have videos and audios where people understand their condition, they learn about their condition, and then they go through a series of brain exercises to train their brain. And the way to think about this is that we are constantly rewiring, we're constantly learning. So if we're learning a new piece of music, we have to sit at the piano or the instrument, and we're unconsciously competent. So we can't redo it ourselves. We've got to consciously think about pressing the keys and learn that piano tune till eventually we can learn it. And now we can just play that piano tune without even thinking about it. It's become unconsciously ingrained within our nervous system, within our brain. And so it is with the brain retraining. Our brain has learnt to play a certain tune because it thinks that is a protective response. And we've got to help the brain unlearn that protective response and tell it that actually that protective response was appropriate for a previous time period, but is not appropriate now. So people learn these brain exercises. They're repetitive brain exercises. We have somatic experiencing, or rather somatic retraining, as we call it. We have some cognitive exercises, then we have some breath work and meditation exercises. And it's putting all these pieces together that finally gets the body well. And being holistic is so important. So we do recommend generally good diet, generally good supplements, generally good sleep. All of those things are important. So it is a combined impact, but the core of what we do that's unique is the brain retraining aspects of it.
Can you talk a little bit about, I think the kind of meditation breathwork stuff is fairly straightforward and people kind of understand that, but I guarantee if they've never done your program, they don't have a sense of kind of your main brain retraining mind map technique. So without giving it all away so that, you're just giving away your knowledge for free here, can you give people kind of a sense of how that works? Because it's basically bringing visualization into things, right? And that's something that even people that I think might have done some kind of mindfulness training or breath work or that kind of thing, they probably haven't done visualization, especially ones where they're talking to themselves, and it can be a little awkward for people, right? Like I used to tell my wife I'm going to go talk to myself in the closet. That's what that's how I described it. But kind of just give people a sense of what that involves and how it works.
Sure. So you're absolutely right. Many people come to us who've spent 10 or 20 years meditating, but they can still go on to having one of these chronic conditioned responses and these illnesses. So breath work and meditation is a preparation. So the way to think about this is, let's say a river. A river is flowing through a field, and it has dug a channel in that field. And that's the way it will always go. The river will go along that route. That's the stimulus interpretation response model. It's the way the brain has learned to create a response. It's a river channel. And we want to divert that river in a different direction. Now, we have to dig a new channel in a different direction. That's the rerouting of that river, of that energy. But the ground is frozen solid. So the river represents a neuronal connection, an automated response, but we need to reroute it. Because the ground is frozen, the thing that unfreezes the ground, that thaws the ground, is breath work, meditation, imagination, relaxation. That enables our brain to become more neuroplastic. And now with psychedelics that have come along, a theory that we have is that psychedelics potentially loosen up the soil and make the brain more neuroplastic temporarily to allow us to be open to new experiences. And there are different connections between different parts of the brain that don't normally connect or hyperconnected, which enable more of this neuroplasticity. So something in the future that we want to look at is, can our program work with psychedelics and actually massively improve outcomes? But, that's just an example I was giving. So we want to make the brain more neuroplastic. So we breathe, we meditate, we calm it down. That's the first step, is relaxing the nervous system. Then the second effect is, if we want the river to divert, we need to keep digging that river channel again and again and again. And that is the power of neuroplasticity, of repetition with emotional intensity. So that the water starts diverting in a different pathway. So as you mentioned, we have a 7-step process with a big, almost like a twister board people put on the floor. And you step through 7 different steps that each have been designed neurologically to allow our brain to be more open to be going along a different path. And the reason this is important is because we're retraining a survival response. So your brain is, your Army and Navy generals are saying, we're here to protect you. And you're in this case, I suppose the most appropriate thing would be the president. Let's say the president or the king or whatever analogy we have. You're saying, no, there's no threat. You guys can stand down, get to DEFCON. Which way is it? DEFCON 5 instead of DEFCON 1. I think I get it right that time. Turn off the alert. But these generals don't believe you. They think you've gone mad. So they keep doing their work. And neuroplasticity is this idea that we keep training them, that the threat is no longer there. So that's why these 7 steps are designed to be able to access the unconscious brain that normally isn't in our conscious awareness, and train it that there is no longer a threat presenting itself. And that's what we do on the 7-step process. The somatic retraining is where we ask people to close their eyes and tune into specifically what their brain is telling them is dangerous. So that's another set of techniques that we've developed. And also something around looking at our personality traits. So even our brain can react to personality traits. As an example, we've had people who have a chronic condition. They might have chronic fatigue syndrome, they might have fibromyalgia, and they heal through our program, but suddenly they sit in front of a laptop. And the moment they sit in front of a laptop, their brain has associated threat with what compromised their immunity last time, which was overworking on a laptop. So the moment they even open a laptop, their brain goes into this hyper defensive response and triggers their entire immune and nervous systems, and they have a relapse. So that shows us that, once again, those conditioned responses to external environments now need to be retrained as well, so the body can come back to its balance. And the third aspect of our program is then retraining, or what we call re-engaging with joy. That there's no point just retraining your brain, but then going back into the same stress responses. We have to be aware of what causes us stress in our external environment, which of our personality traits magnify that, and learn to moderate that. Because when we moderate that, then we stop our nervous system from hyperreacting, and stopping ourselves from having then dips or future relapses. It's a very important part of our program in the third step of it.
Yeah. Talk about that a little bit with the dips thing, because this is a really important part of recovery as well, which is we like to think that we're going to recover in a straight line that is just kind of slow, because normally with the flu or something like that, that's basically what it's like. It's like, I'm just a little bit better, and eventually I feel back to normal. But recovering from these types of conditions is often a squiggly line, and it's a stair step, and it's up and down, and it's like, okay, I'm making progress, and then and talk a little bit about why that is and why it's important to just be like float through dips, I think, as you would say.
Yes. So what happens is one of the critical success factors of brain retraining is continual commitment, despite the dips, despite the relapses. Because as you say, we take a medication for something, we're just used to, well, I take the medication, I'll get gradually better, and then that's fine. You have a very transactional relationship with therapies or treatments. But this is more about you're retraining your brain out of these responses, but your brain will suddenly get triggered by something, suddenly get overstimulated, and will go back to the left-hand path. So if we take an analogy of the left and right path, we are digging the channel along the right-hand path, gradually training the river to go along the right-hand path. But actually, if suddenly there's a flood, the water might go along the left-hand path again. It might find its way down those old river channels. And so therefore, it is that repetition and that commitment that eventually means that the old left-hand path completely disappears and we can go along the right-hand path. So dips are the signpost to recovery. We have to go through those dips. We have to go through those relapses. So we learn those resilience skills for the brain to permanently rewire itself. And I think that's an analogy for life, that we know that, of course, we want to develop resilience through good times, but actually the resilience comes from those challenges, those difficult times, those times when we want to give up, those times when anxiety comes and overwhelms us. It's those times and our ability to navigate those dips, those relapses, even in emotional conditions, that enables us eventually to develop this resilience of character to be able to handle challenges in the future.
Yeah.
And so it is with recovering from these conditions, a similar pathway.
Yeah. I think that was one of the most profound insights that I got from you long ago, which was the kind of broken bone analogy of, if you break your arm, it'll heal, but you don't have a day where, oh, it's fine, and then it's bad, and then it's fine, and then it's bad. That's not how it works. But with a lot of these brain conditions, or whatever you want to call them, even when you're at your worst, and I can speak to this personally, you'll have like a moment or a minute or something where you feel fine. And that's a really key insight to, like, hang on, this isn't like a hardware problem. Like, there's not something broken in me. This is basically a software glitch of some sort, because otherwise it wouldn't do that. It wouldn't be like, oh, for 5 minutes, you're totally fine and feel normal and everything, and then go back to feeling horrible, right? I just thought that that's such a profound insight, and I think it's so helpful for people that are in these conditions. How long does this take people? I know it can vary, but give or take, how long do people need to do this for?
So in our medical studies, and generally within the program, we recommend a minimum of 3 months and continuing for 6 months. And now, we obviously, if we said longer than that, people wouldn't be engaged with it. So we say a minimum of 3 months. And the reason this is important is because you are training your brain out of a survival response, and we don't want to just become complacent. So in our studies, we found 3 months is when you see really big changes, and you need to continue with it for 6 months to consolidate those changes. And I think that it varies for different people. So we have some people that within weeks, especially if they've got, let's say, long COVID and they haven't had it for very long, within weeks, they can get up to 80, 90% better, 95% better. For conditions where people have had it for decades, of course, naturally, we need to commit for longer to keep going with the retraining. For some people, it can take 6 months. For some people, it can take a year of that continual maintenance using the techniques. And that's why we're so loath to give a time scale, because then people operate from that time scale and say, well, I did it for 6 months and
Right.
I was better, but then I've now had a dip, so I must go and find some new supplement on the internet. And we say to people, actually turn it on its head, turn that transaction on its head, and you say, I continue with this as a new way of life, a new way of being to maintain health until I get 100% well and no longer need it. So as we continue with these tools, there'll come a point at which you no longer need them because the right-hand path has been dug so deeply and so profoundly that the river will always flow along the right-hand path now. And that is when the brain has learnt this automatically, right? It's like there'll be songs that we know from, let's say, childhood that we will always remember. Or they always say it's like riding a bike. You'll always remember to ride a bike.
Right.
That's something which is so entrained in our nervous system that even if we are much older, we haven't ridden a bike for 20 years, somehow we'll get on it and eventually remind ourselves how to do it.
Yep.
So that's the point that comes for most people at some point. But to get to that point, we have to have that commitment. So it's like learning to drive a car. And the first lesson, you drive the car and think, I've had 2 or 3 lessons. I still can't drive this car. I'm just never going to be able to do it. You have to keep going, keep going, keep going. Your brain will eventually get it. It will just have that commitment to the number of lessons that you need.
Yeah. I do see, like, again, I'm very familiar with your program and have done it and recommended it to other people. I do see when I see some of your recovery stories, I see people that they'll be like 80% better, 90% better. And it's almost like they kind of plateau right at that spot. And I'm wondering what your take is on this, because I think, because you see other people that are like, hey, I'm 100% better. I wonder if people get to that spot, but to your point about sort of like the new path, right? The new direction of the river. It's almost like they still, even though they've done that and they've habituated a new way to respond to these things, there's still like an identity that they have as being a recovering person, vice a vibrant, healthy person. It's almost like they can't fully believe. What's your take on that? Because that's my take on it.
It can be for different reasons. So I agree that for some people, they don't want to say I'm 100% well because they are still feeling there's a level of identity that they have with a condition.
Yeah.
For others, maybe we've been successful in what we've said, that never become complacent, always monitor this for the rest of your life. So they might think, well, actually yesterday I was a little fatigued, and therefore they're more hypervigilant of their kind of internal experience. But also it's about expectations. So if you ask the average person in the population who doesn't have a chronic condition, what level of health are you at today? Did you know that most people answer,
right.
I'm at about 80, 85%
right.
of what I could be. And so it is that often when we've had a chronic condition, we have no barometer of what is actually feeling well, what is healthy. And sometimes it's very unrealistic because we think that everybody else is running around, with bags of energy. But we know that most people have they rate themselves about 80% of their potential. And so that often is what that discrepancy can be as well, that people have unrealistic expectations of what 100% well and healthy actually means. Yep. There's a fourth reason. As people heal and recover from these conditions, the first 80 to 85% is healing from those vicious cycles that we talked about and retraining. But the last 20%, 15%, that tends to be about how we get back into our normal rhythm of life, how we re-expose to a job or stress or activity. And the body is naturally cautious because it thinks, well, I've had this condition, I've had this vulnerability. If I do a stressful job, how is that going to impact on myself? So the brain itself is continually hypervigilant. So there's a period of rehabilitation of getting back into normal life, getting back into normal activity, and for your nervous system to feel safe and calm. And for that, ongoing relaxation techniques, so the meditative techniques, the breath work, they entrain the nervous system at a deeper level to be even more relaxed and create a buffer zone against stress. And that's what we emphasize to people again and again, that to get to that stage, longer and deeper, whether it's breath work, whether it's meditation, whether it's relaxation, really relaxing the nervous system at deeper levels can get you to that stage of then more health and vitality. And we do have many patients who now say, I'm healthier and have more energy now than I did before I had my condition because I've learned about health, I've learned about well-being, I've learned about self-care.
How long did it take you, by the way, to kind of get back to quote unquote normal in your own experience?
It took about 6 months.
It
took about 6 months of, as I said, and in those days, that was the ad hoc brain retraining. So that was things that I was creating to try and control it in an ad hoc way.
Okay.
And so therefore, that's how it took me that period of time. And of course, even after the 6 months, I recognized my stress triggers and had to make sure that I'm understanding that and relaxing my nervous system to a deeper level. So it was 6 months for the core of it to get to the 85%. And then those final stages of just getting back into normal life, that was periods of 100%, but then also watching out for stress triggers as well.
Yeah. Okay. One thing I love about you too is you're all about, there's a lot of people out there when it comes to things like this, they're like, yeah, but it's all anecdotal. But you're very much about clinical studies and the science behind this and everything. So talk a little bit about that. I don't know if you've funded studies or you've been part of studies, but talk about the actual science and peer-reviewed studies that are out there that support what you're doing.
Yeah, well, this has been such an important part of our work because for us, this only has longevity when there's strong science behind it. And as you will be aware, it's very difficult to get these types of studies funded because most of the money gets funneled to pharmaceuticals, and even from the NIH, CDC, etc. A lot of it is focused in that area. And we have been very fortunate to meet some great researchers who've genuinely cared about patients and patient health, that they've said, okay, even though we don't have funding, how can we do these studies on a shoestring budget? How can we do it in this way or that way? So we have now 7 published clinical studies, 6 of which are independent, completely independent studies. And in those studies, what we've generally found is, I'll give you some kind of anecdotal things. So generally, we've had now 2 randomized controlled trials on fibromyalgia. And we found, compared to a control group, we have halved fibromyalgia. I think a recent one was 54% reduction in fibromyalgia after 3 months, which was a fantastic result. And we compared our program to Lyrica, pregabalin, which is often prescribed for fibromyalgia. And we found we were 6 times more effective than pregabalin and Lyrica at reducing fibromyalgia. And the team actually said to us, and researchers have said, if your treatment was a pharmaceutical drug, it would have had like billions chucked at it right now, because never in medical studies do you see something 6 times more effective than the standard treatment. I mean, that's just,
actually,
because it's not a drug.
That's probably not true, because they don't want people to get that well. It's like, we want you to get kind of well, but then keep having to take our drug, right? Like that's...
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And with long COVID, we compared our program to a wellness program, and that wellness program had sleep, diet, supplements, activity, all the usual things of lifestyle. We compared the 2 treatments after 3 months. The Gupta program was 4 times more effective at reducing fatigue and exhaustion in long COVID patients. And we're doing another long COVID study, which is showing a big halving of inflammation. So we're getting objective measures now, so not just subjective, but objective measures. Big increases in heart rate variability compared to a control group. So we're getting that data coming through soon. And in fact, Chris, you'd be interested, that study was done with the VA, actually, the Veterans Association. So that was a lot of veterans who have been impacted by long COVID, and we were treating them. And as I mentioned, the study on mold illness, that's showing some great results, which hopefully we'll publish next year. And we're doing larger and larger studies. So we have now more studies in the pipeline, one for perimenopause. So a lot of women who have been kind of neglected by the medical profession in terms of some of these very challenging symptoms that come with perimenopause, menopause itself. We've had anecdotally people being improving using our program. So we thought, well, let's actually use our program and see if we can improve the lives of many women. So that's something that's coming out. We're potentially looking at cancer, because you mentioned cancer earlier on. Actually, thinking about cancer once again as an issue of immunity. It's an issue of the immune system not being effective enough at catching those rogue cells. Does our program improve objectively the efficiency of the immune system? And if so, could we improve cancer outcomes? And that's going to be a really fascinating area, and that's something that we're looking at as well. So I'm just excited that if we can get the medical profession on board with these studies, get them to fund larger scale studies, we may then be able to treat a lot more people and really get to the bottom of this. And my vision is, in 5 to 10 years' time, when you go to doctor with anxiety, or it might be panic, or it might be fatigue or mold or long COVID, the first thing that gets prescribed to you is a neuroplasticity program combined with diet and supplement changes. And if we can get to that stage, that means that we fulfilled that vision of healing millions with this.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's something I talk about all the time, but it just speaks to the importance of the fitness of your mind being just as critical, if not more critical than the fitness of your body, as if, and it's not even to say that they're distinct different things. They're obviously, they work together, and it's just so important. And I think people neglect it in such a huge way.
Absolutely. It's that integration of our overall, it's a mind body medicine. It's the overall
Yes.
integration of as saying there isn't a mind, there isn't a body, there's a nervous system. And that
Yeah.
nervous system is one system. There's immune system, it's one system, it's one person. And how can we heal that? And the sources of funding don't normally get attracted to that kind of
Right.
approach. And so our biggest challenge is we need millions of dollars to fund these types of studies. And it's how do we raise those funds? How do we get people to contribute to those larger scale studies? But we know if we did get the funding for those larger scale studies, they would then have such a strong and powerful effect. These would then become mainstream treatments in our view.
Yeah. What else is on, I mean, you mentioned a lot of it there, but what else is on the horizon for you? What's your sort of pie in the sky where the Gupta program eventually ends up?
Well, as I said, it's just more studies on different conditions that we could potentially treat. So I'll give you an example, migraines. We have a lot of people with migraines around the
Mm.
world. We think we can have a big impact on that. We already have a lot of anecdotal evidence on that. And then things like that seem very difficult. So addictions, OCD, huge area, more and more people having those conditions. We've seen, once again, anecdotal improvements in those conditions where they've been untreatable in the past. Then eating disorders. So basically, it's this is a technology for change packaged in a way that is then amenable to people. How do we apply this to so many conditions that previously have been very challenging to treat? And that's my vision. So as I said, in 5 to 10 years time, you might go to your doctor and say, a whole host of different inflammatory conditions, emotional or mental health conditions, and the doctor says, well, we have enough clinical evidence to say brain retraining is the most effective way of dealing with that. And then you nip it in the bud, because the earlier you can catch it, the easier it is to obviously retrain the brain.
Yeah.
So that would be my vision, is that these approaches get it integrated into healthcare systems. And to give an example of this, Chris, what amazes me, there was the most important study I think that was ever published in the history of medicine. Now that's I just take a
That's a
step back
big
and say
statement.
what an arrogant, bold claim that is. But I want to just share this study. There was a study by Harvard in 2015 that looked at something called the relaxation response, and they looked at essentially meditation. And they studied people, and they looked at their medical records for 1 year in terms of how often they saw a doctor, how often they went into a hospital. So they followed them for a year, had all that data. Then they taught them just two things. Number one was daily relaxation techniques, but essentially it was meditation, going into a deep meditative state. And they taught them some mental resilience skills. But the core of it was a daily 20-minute practice of relaxation. They then followed those same people. This was 5,000 people. They followed them for another year. There was a 42% reduction in their usage of medical facilities. So 42% reduction, sorry, it's 43% reduction in their usage of healthcare facilities like a doctor, going to a hospital, etc. And that study should have been front page news. So imagine if you had one medication that would reduce all cause billable hours in medical treatment by 43%. It would be like the most crazy thing in the world. Yet there it was in plain sight, published, and I didn't see anything about this published anywhere. And it was, a study with 5,000 people. So it was a huge, huge study. The control group was 20,000 people. And that shows you that just, we have healthcare problems right now. Western healthcare systems are now essentially not fit for purpose. They're bankrupting countries. They're bankrupting states in Europe, in the States. And actually this one intervention, if we could get this to become part of society and what we do together, we could massively even decrease expenditure on healthcare. But no one seems to have the incentive to actually, put this out there and make this a reality for people. Maybe the new administration, who knows? But I think that just shows you the power. If we can get this into the zeitgeist, get this into something that just becomes very normal, we could really make an impact not only on people's physical health, but on their mental health as well. Can we make things like breath work and meditation become as normal as brushing your teeth in society? It will make such a profound effect on the planet.
Is there anything else that's from your program that we didn't hit on? They're like high points that you think are important to relay to people?
No, I think the main thing is giving people hope. That when you've been from pillar to post, you've been to a nutritionist, you've been to your doctor, you've spending thousands on lots of different ways to try and figure out what's going on in your system. It can often be because we've become trained to think that this is a set of hardware that randomly goes wrong, and we've got to use biomedical agents to try and fix this hardware. And that may be true in certain conditions, and it's certainly something that can help. But if you're still then getting chronic conditions, I want to give people that hope that actually, I think we are close to figuring this stuff out now, that you will heal, you will get better. And it's always about believing in that hope that you can heal. And that by trying something like brain retraining, what we do, or other things out there, that it's just having that ongoing trust that you can heal no matter what you are experiencing.
Yep, 100%. Well, look, it's been so awesome. I was so happy to get you on this podcast. I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time. And just because I think what you do is so important, and it's not cost prohibitive. And it's just behavioral, it's like, just basically do the work and you'll see the results. And I just think it's awesome. So thanks for everything that you do. Keep doing it. And I really appreciate you spending the time with me. Oh, and where can people find it? Where can they get your program?
Sure. So they can come to our website, which is guptaprogram.com. That's GUPTA program.com. And there's loads of free stuff there, free videos, free audios, or you can download our app. So if you go to App Store or Play Store, just type in Gupta Program, Brain Retraining, you'll see the app there as well. And there's lots of free stuff. And with our program right now, if people sign up for our premium program, we offer a 1-year money-back guarantee on that, because until we get large-scale studies, that's the way we operate. So people have nothing to lose by giving it a go and seeing if they notice those improvements.
Yeah. Awesome. Ashok, thank you so much. It's great talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been wonderful. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks for listening to On the X, the official podcast of the Navy SEAL Foundation and an Ironclad original series. Learn more at NavySealFoundation.org or text On the X to 60104. See you next time.